All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. We have Stephen Jenkinson back with us today. Stephen is our philosopher in residence for the month of August. And there's also a three-part series that's serving as a book launch for Stephen's new book, A Generation's Worth, Spirit Work While the Crisis Reigns. It's a really great book. I recommend picking it up, and I'll put the link in the chat and also on the video notes, so you can purchase that. And the first chapter was Die Wise, which we discussed last week, and the second chapter is Matrimony, which is what we will be discussing today. So let's kind of attract our questions towards that theme. And so I guess I'll take in Stephen. Oh yeah, just put your questions in the chat anytime. I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself and you can ask your question, Stephen. And we'll pivot to the questions soon. So I guess I'll take in Stephen with maybe any opening thoughts on Matrimony. And the title again was Matrimony, and then the subtitle of chapter 2 was The Bone House of Love. So perhaps anything you'd like to share with us, Stephen, to launch today's session.
Well, first of all, it's a very odd time of day for philosophy. Then again, I'm not sure there's a time of day quite made for it. So, and then where I live, we've had Southern Gothic weather for a week and a half, which is to say the air is wet and it's not raining. And all of this is a challenge to rise to the project of matrimony. But, this is one of the reasons we're here. I mean, gathered in the meeting, and perhaps in the larger sense of the term here. We're here to sort out this strange alchemy that we do not really command. So, why did I include a chapter in this new book about matrimony? I wonder that myself. Virtually nobody asked me to do it until they heard I was working on it. This is a kind of fascinating anecdote. I'd never have been asked to write a book about this subject. And yet, when I happened to mention that I was, the almost universal response is giddiness, but to the point of euphoria, which suggests that the euphoric people have never read anything I've ever written about any subject. But they were euphoric, I think, with the notion that there'd be finally, I would break down and do a how-to book, or how to not, or how to survive, or how to prevail, or how to triumph. And that's not what happened, largely because the word itself, matrimony, mitigated against it, because it wasn't as, turned out I just couldn't manage it as a standalone proposition, matrimony, neither in life nor in art. Rather, as I said right at the beginning, I think, of the chapter, these two other aspects that constitute the cohort of matrimony kept intruding every time I was trying to get a bead on the kind of the narrow beam which you could understand matrimony to be, so often confused as it has been with marriage. And the other two aspects were patrimony and ceremony. And it was, well, maybe at this point I could read you a little something that just occurred to me as I was glancing through this a few minutes ago before we came on the air, if that's what we've done. So let me try it. And maybe this establishes us just sort of arbitrarily. So here's a bracing thought. Matrimony is a lot like death. As a working deity, it has nothing to do with and no regard for those marzipan effigies on a wedding cake. From what I've seen in my brief but downright careen through the hallways and the archways of life's mansion, it is far from clear that we are benefiting from putting aside the doing of matrimony. Young people wonder out loud with me about whether matrimony can be redeemed enough for them to admit it into their romantic lives. I don't think that is the dilemma before them or before the rest of us. With some humility on the matter and with some residual theistic soulfulness, we could instead consider that we are setting aside some kind of spirit adeptness when we set aside matrimony. And the time may come when we may be unable to learn its subtle ways, particularly its village-making ways, for want of a living example. So I have this unsuspected poverty in mind now, and I have the general willingness of the young to forego the blatant, bloated, and bewildered example of their predecessors in mind. I have in mind what becomes of a love untutored by matrimony and patrimony and ceremony. So that's what we're doing next. It's a cheap shot, slotting it just before Valentine's Day, which, as an aside, we did it on the 13th of February of this year, the live stream on this subject. But this Valentine's Day is a plague beset. This is a Valentine's Day that is plague beset like every other thing these days. So it's proper to wonder what matrimony in a time of plague becomes. But it asks of us whether the pandemic changes anything beyond the seating capacity of the guest hall, and whether it should, and whether it will. A book about matrimony on behalf of matrimony is a frank anachronism now. The subject, the exhortation, they're out of step with the times. This I fully acknowledge. Nobody asked me for it until they heard that I was working on it. And it won't be the book that they've asked me for. Matrimony, when it's taken up at all, is usually mistaken for marriage, and marriage for love, and love for romance, and romance for belonging, and belonging for home, and for God and the world, and for the end of loneliness, and the end of loneliness for salvation. So I had no choice finally. When the other two came to call, patrimony and ceremony, I was obliged to consider, let's call them the real world consequences of pursuing matrimony overtly or covertly, and of failing to do so, and finally of imagining a kind of romantic union that would be best served by no flirtation with matrimony at all. Thought about all those scenarios, and the only interest that philosophy has for me is its civilian aspect, by which I mean how much a working deity the love of wisdom is willing to be. Not, I don't mind contemplation, and on my best days I can do it. But at the end of the day, particularly in a time of trial and torment like a plague, it seems to me that, like everything else, philosophy has to earn its keep. And it may do so principally by coming to hand, not to heel, but to hand. What do you mean by that? I don't know if I talked about this last time, but I have a notion some time ago of the difference between a tool and a machine. Did we talk about this last time?
Yeah,
we did.
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So that's what I mean when philosophy comes to hand, in its best moments, and when we're best served by it and serving it well. It seems to me that our gross limitations and our subtle ones are most manifest, most available to us then, when we're in deep, relentless willingness to see ourselves in the act of coming to a slow or screeching halt, usually involuntarily. So there's something about matrimony that that is an exquisite practice round for the big one, and that's why I had you play that piece in the intro. You didn't hear it all, unfortunately, so it was a bit truncated there. But the name of the piece that we did, which was recorded 5 or 6 years ago in Australia, was called "Love Affair in Reverse," and that's what I was imagining love in the context of dying there, and proposing that the principal attribute of love in a time of ending is the reversal of the normal understanding of getting more than you bargained for, of being on the receiving end, of being the beneficiary. And there's something about matrimony that gives us a chance to taste all these things in controlled, time released formulas that are tradition bound and tradition granted. And we're living a consistently and increasingly tradition free life. And this is mistaken for freedom. Or as Leonard Cohen so gorgeously said, it feels like freedom, but it seems like death. It's something in between, I guess. It's closing time.
So there's a passage in this chapter, normal weddings. And I'll read the first sentence or two.
Okay.
The normal wedding needs an event planner more than it needs a clergy person. That's because it's largely a tradition-free base of operations now. I was wondering if you would like to speak more on that, the state of affairs of the modern wedding.
Well, I'm happy to do so. I should fully, what do they say? Be transparent on the matter and say, first of all, that I don't submit myself to the prospect very often. If I can help it, never. So it's been a long time since I went to a normal wedding. The hybrid event is the one I've tended to officiate at, which is an off-book wedding, if you will. The normal wedding being the book wedding, by the book. And I think the contemporary wedding is profoundly impoverished for the following reason. That it's a faithful and unclaimed bastard child of Greek philosophy. So maybe that's got somebody's attention here is tuned in. So let me now proceed and elaborate what I mean by that. Years ago, I was doing a tour with the band for the Nights of Grief and Mystery, and we were being interviewed, and we were being asked for the umpteenth time why it was called Nights of Grief and Mystery, and what were we doing, and all that. And I said something like, I'm doing it because I know where the monsters are. Not all of them, but in a sort of Don Quixote style. I have a sense of their looming, twisting presence, yeah? And so that's where we were headed, I said. And this took the person aback because they were really hoping I was speaking euphemistically or symbolically. But when I'm talking about monsters, that's serious business. And one ought not to be too symbolic when you're talking about monsters, especially if you're claiming to be willing to approach them. So you do so ceremonially, fundamentally, I think. So let me elaborate what I mean by this. And what has this to do with Greek philosophy anyway? And which Greek philosophy are you talking about? Which era and so on, I know. It seems to me that the contemporary wedding is first and foremost theater. That's where it derives from. Now, in and of itself, there's nothing wrong with that if you're willing for it to be a wedding. But if you want it to be matrimony, you're in trouble, because theater can't carry ceremony. This is the distinction I'd like to make now. Theater is a consequence of what happened to ceremony when Greeks entered a certain period of their civility. And I mean, I'm roughing over a number of hundreds of years to say this, but hopefully I'll be forgiven. The gist of it is that they took ceremony and basically made it accessible, less esoteric than it might have been, democratized it at the expense of its mystery. And they achieved this essentially by introducing two elements into the ceremony, which prior to those times don't seem to me to have existed. The first one is the advent of the audience. So you're saying that in times of ceremonial aplomb, there's no such thing as an audience. This is exactly what I'm saying. I'm saying by definition of the ceremonial undertaking, an audience is banished, dissolved, and incapable of being an audience. Why? Because they are active, engaged, concerned, skin in the game participants. That's why. They have a vested interest in the outcome, for starters. And the outcome depends in large part on the quality of their participation. And so the assumed or the inferred neutrality of an audience is a dangerous proposition when you're ceremony making. Sort of a twin to that is the advent of something you could call the script, which people would mistake tradition for script. So I'm saying here that when the Greeks inflicted script upon ceremony, they ended up with theater. And the fundamental consequence of a script for a ceremonial undertaking is the subversion of the presence of the other world. Because a script, more or less by definition, even in an improvised script, still has the consequence of, to a large extent, predetermining duration and outcome. Not so much the process, but certainly the duration and almost certainly the outcome. So in other words, when you have audience and you have script, the gods have decided to take in another show, if you will, and are very unlikely to participate, right? So we mistake these two attributes for the kingpins of the ceremonial undertaking. So a normal wedding is never surprising, right? Everybody knows what a wedding is, and nobody goes to a wedding to change the world. I sing that as a form of lament, honestly, because I think that much time in, that much psychic and emotional energy, that much expense, that much participation, or at least in the good old days when we could participate actively with each other, all of that properly carries a lot of possibility with it. And all of those possibilities seem to me to be short-circuited by the attempt to impose brevity on the matter, first and foremost. Brevity in the context of a normal wedding seems to me to have the effect of making sure that nothing happens. I think that's what it's there for. I think it's there to corrupt the alchemy of ceremony, to short-circuit it, and to make it so predictable that it becomes an affirmation of everything that was there before and a challenge to none of it. Said differently, you could imagine the contemporary wedding as an affirmation of the feeling state that two people have entered into intensely and otherwise, directed one at the other or on behalf of the other. And what a ceremony, it seems to me, is supposed to do is call into being, call into question what is, and call into being what is not yet. And those things leave by the rear entrance or the fire escape in a normal wedding, such that with the possible exception of people forgetting their lines, which becomes an occasion for laughing, and in those jurisdictions when the officiant is still obliged to say, if anyone here knows any reason why these two people should not be joined in the holy state of matrimony, please speak now or forever hold your peace. There's an awkward moment, and inevitably someone cracks some kind of joke, right? To do what? To dispel the awkwardness. Why? Because it's a formality, that's why. But once upon a time, it wasn't a formality. It was an acknowledgement, not just of the possibilities of unregistered bigamy and the rest, but because there could be all manner of other reason that this thing, its shelf life is unlikely and its advisability is challengeable. And the village making possibilities that are alive in a ceremony and in matrimony are ill served by proceeding. In other words, it would have been, among other things, a hefty kind of spirit level negotiation on behalf of the two most invested parties. And all of this is gone, of course, now, and it's an affirmation of what already exists. It's something like a weather report looking out the window. That's what a contemporary wedding strikes me as fundamentally being. It's supposed to wonder about the prevailing weather between two people, not report upon it, and certainly not reward it. Because ultimately, it seems to me that the ceremony of matrimony is there to give the culture another chance to see itself in action and to yearn towards what it means to be, not to affirm the kind of brick shithouse of certain mutual certainty that people have built for each other and are proposing to move in. It's a little unceremonious, the image, but I think it suits. I could say a lot more, but I should give somebody else a chance.
Jessica, you had a comment or thought?
Oh, yeah. Thank you. I think what I'm hearing you say is something akin to last time when you talked about wisdom not being able to exist outside of its context. And so that in the marriage ceremony, as we mostly go to it now, it sounds like maybe we've lost our understanding of our role. So if I'm invited to come into a wedding, if I'm acting as a conscious witness to the ceremony, and if I could, with reverence participate in that aspect of the role, would that be a different thing? And so if I'm not doing that and just spectating, then that's sort of the rote aspect of it, and we're just going through the motions. Is that kind of, am I understanding that properly?
This may be your understanding indeed, and it's a wonderful alternative to what I described, but that's not what I'm suggesting.
Okay.
No. What I'm suggesting is something closer to this. The normal wedding, which is turning into a piñata, I guess, for me to beat on with a stick, obviously right away. But the contemporary, the normal wedding, the thing we would most understand as the recognizable wedding among us in Anglo-North America, is principally an exercise in affirmation, rote affirmation, uncritical, unchallengeable affirmation. That's what it's there for, right? That's what it's come to. The only way that could have happened is it had to lose a lot of spirit and ceremonial charge along the way to become that housebroken and that domesticated. You see, it's we mistake it for a wolf, but it's a chihuahua. By which I mean it asks virtually nothing of anyone participating. It's certainly nothing that they weren't prepared to quote unquote give. So what are we affirming when we, as a matter of course, simply, offer an uncritical and vague kind of amen to these two people in the front and what happened to, for example, in all of those weddings when the eventual consequence of the wedding was dissolution and divorce? Was there just not enough affirmation? Is that Is that what happened? And I'm going to go out on a limb here and suggest that one of the principal contributors to the demise of the wedding is the mania for affirmation, is the quote, the kind of, what would I call it? A kind of ceremonial equivalent of unconditional positive regard. Like, this is the one day that nobody needs to get out of jail card because there's no jail. Because if these two people want to be together, how fabulous is that? And we ought to get behind it. And I mean, people need support, of course, but what aspect of them needs to be supported? Is it the part of them that they're most sure of? Is it the part of them most deeply invested, unhesitatingly in this project of being together? Or could it be all the stuff that they had to let go of and set aside in order to get this far and say these things to each other? And I mean, I could go on and about this, but and you can tell I have done time review, but I simply offer this to you as a given what I'm talking about. So we have the word in the English language, vow. As far as I've been able to tell, I've been around for a while. I just had my 67th birthday, so I think I'm qualified as a general reporter of the current regime, right? Not an uncritical one, but I can faithfully report and say to you that it's been my experience that virtually nobody uses the word vow, except if they're talking about weddings. Otherwise, the word virtually never appears. There's a reason for that, which I'm going to get to presently. But let me begin with the description of what happens when people congregate at the front of the hall or in the circle in the field or, in the sand on the beach or wherever they're doing this thing. What do they understand themselves to be saying to each other when the time comes when they play badminton with their commitment back and forth? I'm suggesting that what they're engaged in there is something they have so little experience in doing that it really raises the question about their adequacy to the task at hand of making vows. Why? Because largely vow is misapprehended as being identical in function and consequence to a promise. They would be probably found to be synonyms in any dictionary. And so I'm going to suggest to you that far from being synonyms, they're bordering on antonyms. And here's why. So the notion of a promise is fundamentally conditional. That is to say that when you're making a promise, though you may not build any conditions into the arrangement, there is a thing that you need and that you count on, that you invoke and rely upon when you're making the promise. You may not say it explicitly, but it's there, and it's called the future. That's what a promise needs. A promise needs time to play itself out, because in all honesty, you are making a declaration about what you're going to do when you're promising. And that's the condition that's inadvertently built into every promise that's made. And the things that are happening in the wedding ceremony are properly not promises. Okay? Because they don't require the future, because something's happening now. That's what a ceremony is. It's not an investment in the futures market. A ceremony is an event taking place in real time in your presence, and you could miss it if you think it's promises and the future and happily ever after. Because the vow, the nature of a vow is telling you otherwise. The way the vow functions is by virtue of you saying it, you are enacting it. It is entirely a present tense proposition. And in that sense, it's charged much more with the kind of spiritual aspect of engagement with the divine in real time, not in time out of time, in real time, but in a kind of fashion that slows down our ordinary experience of time to the point where it doesn't seem to be moving at all. Exactly. It's not moving to the future. The extraordinary consequence of making vows is you're slowing down time to the point where it's almost observable in its increments. And the increment you're inhabiting now is, by virtue of saying this thing, you are doing the thing that you're saying. You're not saving it for a rainy day. You're entirely inhabiting the function by virtue of invoking it. That's to say, putting it to voice. So it's a powerful proposition to reconsider what vows are and how they function. And it seems to me the contemporary wedding basically is a promissory note masquerading as a ceremony. It's rather a devastating indictment. I didn't realize I was that hard on the whole thing, but clearly I am.
Anything you'd like to share, Jessica, as a follow-up?
No, just thank you. Yes, thank you for clarifying and everything that followed, especially the differentiation between promise and vow. That was super impactful, and I'm grateful. Thank you.
It's amazing, isn't it? It's sitting right there in the language for us. It's hiding in plain view. Just when you think you finally got a decent synonym for vow, it turns out you got mismatched socks on, right? And one of them can't possibly exist in the presence of the other because it's undone by the other. Yeah. So when you're talking about the promises you're committing to in the future, you're not capable of making vows at the time because the future has subverted your capacity to inhabit the present moment and to incarnate what you're declaring. And the power of a vow is that you're almost naked in its presence because you must be doing the thing. And that's why you're saying stuff, it seems to me. And that's why, well, among things, that's why if there's a script, it's very challenging to engage vows. And the typical wedding ceremony, as I said earlier, people don't go to it to change the world. People don't go to it, it seems to me, to revolutionize their take on what it means for people to be together, or why we are congregating at this moment, or what's being asked of us by virtue of being invited, aside from eating when the time comes and speaking awkwardly and in an arch sort of way when the time comes, or telling rather arcane stories about the childhood of one of the supplicants or the other. Anyway, thank you for the question.
Laura, you had a question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen, for coming. It's really a beautiful wisdom you're delivering, sharing, expressing. I just had a quick question, just to kind of begin at the beginning. What is matrimony? What does it mean?
Would you be able to repeat the question, please? Because I didn't hear all of it.
Oh, sorry, my connection is poor. I was wondering, just to kind of begin at the beginning, what is matrimony?
Okay. I'm not sure matrimony is the beginning of anything, but I take the spirit of your question. And so I began earlier in this session by talking about the sidekicks of matrimony being patrimony and ceremony. I've talked a little bit about ceremony now, just to give you a feel for not what I mean with the word, but its old order. In fact, let me begin with the etymology of the word ceremony then. And eventually I will add some three-dimensionality to what I mean by the word matrimony, which I think is what you're asking for. Okay. So the best etymology on ceremony is deeply frustrating. depending on what you were looking for. Because it turns out that there is no ancestry to the word ceremony. It doesn't come from various interesting places and bring, trailing clouds of interesting cultural glory with it as it comes and the rest. It turns out that the word ceremony is an inadvertent confession made by the Latins, made by the Romans. And here's what it was. It's a loaner word. It's not even their word. It comes to us from Latin, but it's not in its origin a Latin word. The first half of the word is, if I'm remembering right now, is a Phoenician city-state that was an object of particular attention and envy among the Latins because they had certain cultural proclivity and capacity that the Latins couldn't dream of on their own, including a degree of public sphere ceremonial undertakings for which the Latins had no word, collectively or individually. So they actually hybridized a word to tell their own people, our practice here has been taken from elsewhere. It's from this city, you see, and those people, because we had no equivalent. It's amazing to me that, the word is said with hallowed, hushed tones often in Anglo-North America, the part of the world that I know about. And in actual fact, it's this kind of reluctant confession that the people who gave us the word had no similar practice, actually had to borrow the practice once they conquered the people. So there's that. And then earlier in this call, I tried to give you a feel for two aspects of what happened to ceremony on the way to being theatricized, if you will, by the advent of audience and the advent of script. Okay. Now, it's not possible, I don't think, to talk realistically about what matrimony might be, not what do we want it to be, but let's be faithful to the etymology of the word, at least for a beginning, and say that matrimony takes its shape and form and color as a consequence of the, say, parallel presence of patrimony and vice versa. Now, this is going to be, I'm realizing now, a bit of a long answer. So if you need to get a drink halfway through, please feel free to go ahead and do so. Okay. Now, you and I both know that any word in contemporary English usage that begins with P-A-T-R-I or A, you're asking for it, right? It's been so criminalized fundamentally and disqualified as a legitimate cultural undertaking that it's not clear to me that I can talk about it free of that, even temporarily free of all those chains and carbuncles and manacles and all the rest. Well, the truth of the matter is that the word, the prefix of patrimony and matrimony do not mean man and woman. They don't mean gender in the terms that we have come to mean it. And I don't mean just in the last 10 years. I mean in the last X hundred years. That these are actually words that describe a function, not an identity. And as such, they're not to be understood as bound to questions of gender identity, because it's not a personal identity. Matrimony and patrimony describe functions that are, let's say, typically aligned with one gender or another, but not necessarily and certainly not exclusively, because the functions that they're talking about are the functions that we would normally describe as parenting functions, not gender, very much secondarily identity, first and foremost, a culturally informed, culturally endorsed undertaking. Yeah. So if it helps for me to clarify something I've said, you just signal me visually. Just 1 second. and I'm happy to try to say it again. So in terms of the undertakings of patrimony and matrimony, it's very likely, I think, historically, that patrimony came first, not as a status observation, but as a chronological observation, or as a pre and post observation. So patrimony as a function is fundamentally the act of fathering. That's the first half of the word. The moni part means something in the kin of how you might recognize the nature of, and in this case of patrimony, how you might recognize the nature of fathering in the act of it appearing. That's what patrimony very briefly means, and that's what matrimony means, just changing the word to mothering. However, it's principally a culturally informed, culturally endorsed, culturally employed proposition. And so it's given its marching orders by the culture. It's not left to individual people in a working culture to predetermine for their own purposes what constitutes patrimony and matrimony. It's recognizable to the culture at large. Okay. Next attribute then would be this. The principal patrimonial function could be understood in a, this is going to sound perhaps Neanderthal to you. And the reason for that is, it is Neanderthal. This is caveman, as my best attempt to recreate some sensibility, which is our distant inheritance. I'm going to imagine the following situation. We know that the mammalian reproductive system is principally attuned to food supply in terms of its willingness to kick into high gear reproductively. This is a fact. And it turns out that I've lost the visual contact with the questioner. That's okay. I assume she's still there. Yes, keep going.
My connection is spotty, but I'm here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right. I understand. I've had similar connections in my time as well. Okay, so I'll keep going. So relative to the reproductive system, you can see why I'm talking about it now, because it's related to the function of matri and patri, principally fathering, right? Which is secondarily reproductive, principally nurturative. So the mammalian reproductive system is tuned to a minimum of stress and torment and trouble in the ambient surroundings. And speaking as a farmer who has livestock on the farm, we see this all the time. And in some ways, it is manipulated in terms of domestication of livestock. There's no doubt. So I've seen what I'm talking to you now about happen over and over again. So with the availability of food, an enabling environment, a stable enabling environment, the capacity for matriarchy comes about. The willingness of the individual women in question to submit themselves to the slings and arrows of reproduction and pregnancy and all of that are, at a fundamental level, a consequence of an enabling environment that reassures the woman in question and the culture in question about the possibilities. In a word, that's what patrimony is. In a word, the function of patrimony is to establish the enabling environment whereby the matrimony can take place, is willing to take place, to take its chances on life. So you could, if you wanted to sound very formulaic about it, I'm not sure I do, but anyway, I'll say this part. It falls to the work of patrimony. I'll say it differently, excuse me. It seems that the use of the word patrimony virtually never takes place in my hearing in common English. Patriarchy, as you well know, yes, but patrimony, virtually never. And it's fascinating to me that in a ceremonial context, I have never heard anyone being invited to enter into the hallowed presence of patrimony. Never taken place. It's always matrimony. And in an age that fancies itself to be the high water mark of inclusivity, that's an amazing observation to make. But it's fitting in a mysterious way to me. Here's why: because patrimony precedes matrimony, and so you could say if you've come to the point of the matrimonial ceremony, it's because the work of patrimony has already taken place and got everyone and the culture that far that they could contemplate the wild spirit alchemy of matrimony and practice it and embody it and try to live it out. That's a very rough and very fast rendering of matrimony and its relationship to patrimony. Basically, you could say, to answer your question most nakedly, that the matrimonial function is the function of mothering secondarily individual human beings. Primarily, it's a mother to a culture. It's the whole regime of nurturative functions and repertoire available to people that the culture has articulated for them. And let me stop there. I think that's enough detail on one question.
Any follow-up share, Laura?
Just briefly, sorry. Thank you again, and I apologize about my connection. I was just wondering, like spiritually between individuals, what does that mean? Matrimony from, the interior of their spiritual lives. What does it mean to marry?
Well, it's very difficult to piece your question together because of the problems in the connection. If I could possibly cash out the idea that I just described to you in terms of the relationship between two people, did I look like if it's taking place between two people?
And spiritually, interiorly.
No, I don't know what you said, but let me try anyway, so we're not thwarted entirely by this technical problem. I'm suggesting to you that the fundamental reality, there's a certain architecture, right? Romance being a good example. That romance is there as the enabling agent, you could say, or I could say differently, romance is there to give as a staging area for the culturally informed understanding of matrimony to appear. But the fundamentals of matrimony are not an exchange between two people. The fundamentals of matrimony are an alchemical consequence of the willingnesses of tribes that two individuals represent. Because there's no more than between two people. It sounds like a painfully obvious thing to say, but what I mean by that is the temporary sameness that they feel about and towards each other won't last. Of course it won't last. It's not supposed to last, you see? Another way of saying it is, and I think maybe this is the spirit aspect you're asking about, that there are reasons that people get married, and there are reasons that people stay married, and they are rarely the same groups of reasons. Why? Because the reasons that people get married are reasons cobbled together by amateurs, meaning these people don't know each other all that well. they haven't done this part yet, right? This aspect of the other person, the matrimonial aspect, is basically unknown to them. It's imagined, it's promised, it's declared and everything, but it hasn't been lived, right? So it's fundamentally terra incognita, legitimately so. And so it seems to me that the first order of business in romance should be ambivalence. But you know that it doesn't work in a contemporary culture that doesn't understand these subtleties. There's no time for ambivalence, particularly in the ceremony of marriage. People think either it's a bad joke, a poorly timed joke, or your sick idea of a joke. But they're all hoping that it's a joke, that you're not really saying, I'll do what I can do, you know. But the honest truth would be that's what you should be saying. Everything I think I'm capable of, I haven't done it all. And now I'm standing up here doing these alpha and omega declarations and never having done so. So it stands to reason that I could be off by a few points. You know, I could miss the mark entirely. But it seems to me that in a place that makes you choose between ambivalence and romance, then being of more than one mind is the first casualty. I'll say it differently. Having a three-dimensional mind on these matters tends to be an early casualty of the amateur and immature understanding of romance that characterizes the West today.
All right. Thank you, Laura. And perhaps we'll, given the connection, perhaps we'll squeeze in one more question, then we'll end off here today. Evan, you had a question.
Yeah, so my question is has to do with what you were speaking of about vow versus promise, and has to do with the notion of sacrifice as consecration of the thing being sacrificed, and the relation of this to the concept of both marriage and matrimony. Specifically, I'm thinking that so like vow itself is cognate with the Sanskrit word that means one who offers a sacrifice. And so it seems to me that there's something going on where there is a sort of element of sacrifice involved in marriage or matrimony that has been swept under the rug in our culture in the ways that you have described. And so my sort of hesitating reaching for what the sacrifice is, how it's consecrated, and what it might be has something to do with the idea of the two individuals joining in and sacrificing some optionality, some paths now no longer taken, in a way that is consecrated and connects the present to the future and past. But I don't know if that's right, and I'm curious just to hear your thoughts on that connection between like sacrifice, vow, matrimony, yeah, whatever comes up.
Okay. No, that's very well imagined. And, you know, trying to make connections is, if nothing else, both athletic and aesthetic. I would say, though, that on the matter of sacrifice, the etymology serves us well here. The word sacrifice comes from two Latin words, right? And one of them is sacred, and we could go into great detail about the meaning, but for the moment, let's imagine that there's some kind of consensus about sacred. But the other part of the word, though, it's the way we get our word fashion, the verb to fashion. That's the root word. It means to make. So explicitly, the act of sacrificing is the act of making sacred. Now, the dilemma, the cultural dilemma that's buried in here, is the notion that humans are in the sacred making business, that they should be, that they have to be. And there's two dilemmas to it. One is, it's not clear to me that humans are not that good at the sacred. And secondly, it implies a primordial kind of a rupture that requires sacrifice to reordain something of the ordinary world, if you will. So in other words, it carries a primordial a story of either trespass or at the very least some rupture in continuity that blessed the world. And that's what brings me to what I'd like to read to you in response. See what you think about this. This is from a little mini chapter in the book called Blood. Now, blessing is not tidings of joy. Bless, as a word, comes from the Old English for blood. They knew in those days that if you were to bear down upon a person or an event with blessing, there was some bloodying to be done, some bloodying to be had. The blessed, they are the ones who survived the onset of the blessing. Let me say that again. The blessed are those who survived the onset of the blessing. There are casualties to blessing. The word is telling us so. Things will not be as they were if you petition for blessing or if you bestow it. Not everything lasts when blessing comes around. It's the change. It's the end. The bloodying that lends blessing its charge and its consequence. Among those who understand, blessing is a weighty thing. It is not approval. It's something else. That's why the blessing of the elder and of the aged can be so potent. It comes from those with more endings in tow and more gore on the transom. To bless a human union, you daub it with life, the part of life that ends. It's the blood of the end of every other could have been and would have been and should have been that now won't be and probably will never be. It is not cleansing. It is not purifying. It is staining, reminding and making sure that the heavy draw that matrimony makes upon the world is not lost on the merrymakers and the witnesses and the marzipan models atop the cake. It marks the young especially with irreversible consequence. So there's more to say, but you can see why I chose to read that to you in response to what you said. Yeah, I know that we're at the sort of alleged end of our time here. Maybe I should stop there.
Any quick follow-up, Evan?
I guess it's a beautiful passage you read, and so what's coming to mind is, I guess I'm just feeling this strong sense of the sort of alchemical, the transformational aspect of that. Like what seems to be happening there, in the way I would describe it, has to do with an alchemy of the blood, and I wonder if that's a intended takeaway or not.
Well, I think so. It's, I was a servant of the word when I did the elaborated etymology there, and especially the gore on the transom, all of those images. Okay, the practice I'm suggesting here is one of invoking endings as a way of holding high what you would propose to bless. In other words, it's not just rarefied air that the Blessed One occupies. There's a sense of the oncomingness of endings that blessing invokes as well. In other words, you have to choose. This is one of the hells of being a human being, is that the choice for is multiply compounded by choices against. That's the nature of the beast. And to be capable of ambivalence is to be three-dimensional in that challenge. And one of the sad things about our understanding, or our kind of withered education about romance, is that romance is taken to absolve you of all these ambivalences. In actual fact, it should be one of the most intense visitations of, primordial ambivalence. That's what romance should properly be. And that's why you need help. And that's why matrimony, when it's understood and undertaken by a real culture, is first and foremost a village-making proposition that simply employs the feeling that two people have for each other as another temporary moment when it can reiterate itself.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
You bet.
Yeah, that was awesome. So Stephen, perhaps we'll close here. Any words you'd like to leave us with? And then the outro I was going to play was Bittersweet.
Oh man, it's a great song. Yeah. Let me just take another minute, because who knows if, if something weird happens and we never get to do this again. Just give me a second here. I never get a chance to do this, so it's rather exciting, and I've really appreciated the hour, and I can't believe it's gone by so fast. So I'd like a recount to see if we've missed a few minutes somewhere along the way. Well, how about this? The term bone house, which is in the subtitle of the work, is almost never used by modern English-speaking people. It prompts prurience in an arched eyebrow and not much more. One reason? Well, the sound of the word. It has a kind of slasher film aesthetic attached to it. It could mean where the bones are kept, or a crypt, or an ossuary, or a mausoleum. It could mean what's under it all. It could mean what death makes of us. But no surprise, it's that way at all. It really means what life makes of us. The bone house is where and how we get to love. And so I'm meaning here that human love needs its conveyances, its media, its allies. It ought not to rely upon the steadiness of the human heart, and it doesn't. Matrimony, with all of its time-worn traditions, its choreography and its geography, its hierarchies, its patriarchy and its matriarchy, its matrimony. That's how love gathers itself in people, how it gathers people, how it does its work. Matrimony gathers up witnesses as it goes, and so forgets only to forget. Thanks for listening, folks.
Thank you, Stephen. So Stephen will be back at the final session of this Philosopher in Residence series on the 20th. Again, RSVP on the stoa.ca. Pick up a generation's worth on his website. I'll include the link in the video notes. And then we'll close out listening to Bittersweet.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen.
Beneath the truth lies the bones of a truth more complete than I'll bet everything I own. It's a truth that's bittersweet. Beneath the waves of pleasure, beneath the tangled sheets, it all comes together. Still it's all bittersweet. So here to the highs, here's to the lows. The human heart endures, and so it goes, and so it goes.